The dust had not yet settled on her husband's grave when Cora Graves walked into the roughest cattle town in the New Mexico territory and asked a stranger for a job. It was the spring of 1884, and Dusty Creek was the kind of place that ate the weak alive and spit out the bones before supper. The main street ran long and crooked, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised more than they delivered. A mercantile that ran short on flour more often than not, a saloon that never ran short on trouble, a livery that smelled of manure and desperation, and a small land office that nobody trusted. The sky above it all was enormous and indifferent, the kind of blue that made a person feel very small and very alone, and Cora Graves, 26 years old with coal dark hair and eyes the color of dry earth after rain, felt both of those things as she stood in front of the Lockhart Ranch supply post and read the hand-painted sign in the window. Help wanted. Strong back. No complaints. She had no complaints. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag with 2 dresses, and a photograph of the man she had buried 3 weeks ago in the hard red soil of the Pecos Valley, and a stubbornness that people who knew her called a character flaw, and she called survival. Her husband, Thomas Graves, had been a good man when he was sober, and he had been sober more often than the rumors in Pecos County suggested. He had not died drunk, and he had not died in a fight. He had died of fever, quickly and without much ceremony, leaving behind a homestead claim that was underwater in debt, a mule that had gone lame, and a wife who had never once in her life asked anyone for anything she had not earned. Cora pushed open the door of the supply post. The interior was dim and smelled of leather, tobacco, and dried beans. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, packed with everything a ranch hand or a homesteader might need. Behind the counter, a man was bent over a ledger with his back to her, and she could see he was tall, even crouched over a counter broad across the shoulders, wearing a plain cotton shirt the color of old bone, with dark hair curling at the back of his neck as though it had been cut recently but not recently enough. She cleared her throat. He did not turn around immediately. He finished writing, whatever he was writing, with the kind of deliberate patience that most men in the territory had not bothered to develop, and then he straightened and turned, and Cora Graves got her first look at Lionel Lockhart. He was 30 years old, though he looked a year or 2 older from the sun, and the work lean-jawed with deep-set brown eyes that assessed and cataloged in about 2 seconds and then softened, almost despite themselves, into something careful and attentive. He had a scar along his left jawline that was old and white, and his hands when he set down his pencil were the hands of a man who worked, not managed. He looked at her without the usual sweep of a man looking at a woman alone in a frontier town, and that alone set him apart from every other man she had encountered since Thomas had died. "Can I help you?" he said. "I am here about the sign," Cora said. She kept her voice level and her chin up, which took effort because she was tired in a way that went all the way down to her marrow. "The one in the window, help wanted." Lionel Lockhart studied her for a moment. "That sign is for ranch work," he said. "Fence riding, hauling, mucking stalls, moving cattle, hard work." "I read it," she said. "It said strong back and no complaints. I have both." He tilted his head very slightly, the way a man does when something surprises him but he is too composed to show it plainly. "You have ranch experience." "I homesteaded for 4 years in Pecos Valley." "I have split rail, strung wire, hauled water, broken horses, planted and harvested and doctored cattle through blackleg. I can also cook, keep books, and fix a saddle. I am not asking for a favor. I am asking for wages." The last sentence came out sharper than she intended, carrying the edge of a woman who had already endured a great deal of sympathetic head tilting and hushed condolence from neighbors who brought casseroles and whispered about what she was going to do now, and whether her family back in Missouri would take her in, as though she were a broken piece of furniture to be shipped home. She had not gone back to Missouri. She had come to Dusty Creek because Thomas had once mentioned that the Lockhart Ranch north of town was the most solid operation in 3 counties, and the man who ran it paid a fair wage and did not cheat his workers. Thomas had been right about a great many things. Lionel Lockhart set both his hands flat on the counter and looked at her with those deep brown eyes that she would later learn saw more than most people wanted them to. "What is your name?" he said. "Cora Graves." Something moved across his face very briefly, a recognition, a small softening that he controlled before it became pity, and she caught it and felt her jaw tighten. "I know the name," he said. "Thomas Graves held a claim down near the Pecos. I bought hay from him twice." "Then you know he was a capable man," she said. "I worked alongside him every day of those 4 years. I'm not some town woman who has never seen the working end of a horse." "I never said you were," Lionel said, and there was something in his tone that was not patronizing and not performatively neutral either. It was simply honest, and that disarmed her slightly. "The work I have open right now is at the main ranch house. My housekeeper left last month to go to her daughter in Santa Fe, and my foreman's wife, who was filling in, just had a baby. I need someone who can manage the domestic side of the operation while also being capable enough to step in outdoors when needed. It is a genuine position. It pays $12 a month and found room, board, and meals. $12 a month and found. It was not a fortune, but it was fair, and the room and board meant she would have a roof and food while she figured out what came next. She had $4.30 in her carpet bag. She had no other options that did not involve swallowing a great deal of pride. "I will take it," she said. "Do not you want to know more about the terms? You said $12 a month and found. You said it was genuine work. That is enough." He regarded her for another moment, and she had the strange feeling that he was not trying to assess whether she could do the work but whether she was all right in the deeper sense of the word, and she squared her shoulders and returned his gaze without blinking until he nodded once. "All right," he said. "You can start today if you are ready. I will drive you out to the ranch before supper. I have a room in the house. It was the housekeeper's. It is clean and private." He paused. "Do you have a horse?" "No." "Do you have belongings you need to collect from somewhere?" "Everything I have is in that bag." He did not say he was sorry. He did not make the face that everyone else made, the face that made her want to scream. He simply nodded again, with a matter-of-factness that she found she could breathe around, and said, "I need to finish closing the books here. There is a chair behind the stove if you want to sit." She did not sit. She stood near the window and looked out at the street and felt something that she did not have a name for, yet something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, like the first moment you come in out of hard weather, and the heat of an indoor fire reaches your face before the rest of you has warmed up. She would not understand until much later that Lionel Lockhart had known exactly who she was when she walked through his door. He had heard from a supply rider 2 weeks earlier about the widow Graves down in Pecos Valley, a young woman left in a bad situation, capable and proud and not likely to accept charity. He had put that sign in his window the very next day. His housekeeper had, in fact, left the previous month, and he had genuinely needed help. That part was true. But he had also made the deliberate choice to make the position real and the wages fair and the offer clean, because he understood that what she needed was not a handout dressed up in kind words, but actual work with actual dignity attached to it. He gave her work. He also gave her an ease she had not had in months, and he was careful to make the second thing look exactly like the first. The Lockhart Ranch sat 4 miles north of Dusty Creek, at the base of a long red ridge that caught the afternoon light and turned it the color of coals. It was larger than Cora had expected, a main house of 2 stories built from adobe and timber, solid and well-maintained, a barn and attached corral that could hold 40 horses, 3 outbuildings for supplies and equipment, and a bunkhouse that housed 8 ranch hands. The land around it ran to open grass country in the east and rougher terrain climbing toward the ridge in the west, and there were cattle visible in 2 directions when Lionel drove the wagon up the long dirt road. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the ranch take shape as they approached it, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, something that resembled possibility. Lionel had said very little on the drive out, which suited her. He had pointed out landmarks, the dry creek bed that ran with water in spring, the rock formation that served as a windbreak for the north pasture, the neighbor's fence line a mile to the east. With the same practical economy he seemed to bring to everything, and she had listened and catalogued, because she was that kind of person. She met the foreman, a weathered and laconic man named Abe Purvis, who was 40-something and looked like he had been carved from the same material as the surrounding landscape. He shook her hand without comment, assessed her with the flat, practical eyes of a man who judged workers by their output and not their biography, and went back to whatever he had been doing. It was, she decided, a better welcome than a great deal of sympathy would have been. The housekeeper's room was at the back of the main house, off the kitchen small, with a single window that looked out toward the ridge, a narrow bed with a good mattress, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. It was clean, as he had said, and private, as he had promised, and when he showed her the room and then immediately left her to it without lingering or making conversation, she stood in the middle of it with her carpet bag and felt something shift in her chest like a knot loosening very slightly. She unpacked her 2 dresses. She put Thomas's photograph on the nightstand, face up, because she was not yet ready to put it face down, and was not sure she owed anyone the pretense of being ready for that. She washed her face at the washstand and put on the second dress, which was slightly less worn than the first, and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was large and well-equipped by frontier standards, a cast-iron range, a good supply of fuel, copper pots, a pantry stocked with staples. She spent an hour taking inventory and then cooked supper for Lionel and herself and Abe Purvis, who came in from the barn smelling of horse and leather, and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who rarely got home-cooked food. She made biscuits from scratch and a beef and bean stew from what was in the pantry, and nobody said much at the table, which she preferred to the alternative. After Abe went back to the bunkhouse and the table was cleared, Lionel sat at the kitchen table with his ledger and his pencil, and she washed the dishes in the basin, and neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences could be. It was working silence, the kind that settles between 2 people who are both occupied and content to be so. "The bread is better than anything I have had in 2 months, Lionel said, without looking up from his ledger. "I will take that as a reference," she said. She heard him make a small sound that was, she thought, the closest thing to a laugh that he was likely to produce without warning. In the days that followed, Cora Graves worked. She worked the way she had always worked, which was hard and without exhibition. She learned the routine of the house and improved it quietly, reorganized the pantry so that supplies could be inventoried at a glance, established a washing schedule, repaired 2 saddles that had been left in the tack room in a sorry state because the previous housekeeper had not known how and Lionel had not had time. She helped Abe dose cattle when the regular hand was down with a bad ankle. She drove the supply wagon to Dusty Creek twice without being asked, and came back with everything on the list plus a few items that she had noticed were running low and had added without comment. Lionel noticed all of it. He noticed in the way that a careful man notices things, without making a show of it, without cataloging it aloud, but with a growing and specific attention that was different from the general appreciation an employer might feel for a competent worker. He noticed that she was up before him in the mornings, which meant before 5, and that she did not seem to feel any special virtue about it, but simply operated that way. He noticed that when one of the young ranch hands, a nervous 18-year-old named Denny, cut his hand on a barbed wire strand, it was Cora who cleaned and bandaged it with a sure-handed practicality that calmed the boy without coddling him. He noticed that she rarely asked for anything but rarely needed to, because she anticipated what was needed and addressed it, and he noticed that she read in the evenings by the kitchen lamp, holding her book close to the light, and that she had a way of going very still when she was reading that made the room feel quiet in a good way. He noticed that she did not talk about Thomas Graves. He did not bring it up. He understood, in the way that a man understands things he has learned from loss of his own, that there was a time for grief to be witnessed and a time for it to be private, and that a person who had spent weeks being witnessed by well-meaning neighbors might very desperately need the second kind. So he gave her the second kind, which meant not asking, not pressing, not offering comfort she had not asked for. What he did instead was ensure that the work was real and dignified and plentiful, because he had understood from the moment she walked into his supply post with her chin up and her spine straight that the most respectful thing he could offer her was the chance to be useful. It was, as it turned out, exactly what she needed. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she caught him at the desk in his study going over the land survey records, and she knocked on the open door and said, "The books for the household accounts are wrong." He looked up. "Wrong how?" She came in and set the household ledger open in front of him and pointed to 3 separate entries. "These 2 entries are duplicates. You paid the hardware supplier in Dusty Creek twice in February for the same order of nails and hinges, and this 3rd entry is miscalculated by $4.12. He looked at the entries, then looked at her. "How did you find this?" "I was reconciling the household accounts against the supply receipts. I do that every month." She paused. Thomas always said it was the small errors that buried a man over time. It was the first time she had said Thomas's name to him directly, and she seemed to notice it herself because there was a very brief moment where something passed through her expression, not breaking, not grief exactly, but a kind of honoring before she became matter-of-fact again. "He was right about that," Lionel said. She nodded once and left him to correct the books. Later that evening, he went to the kitchen where she was sitting at the table with her own ledger and her cup of coffee going cold beside her, and he set an additional $2 on the table next to her coffee cup. She looked at them. "What is this?" "You found $8 in accounting errors," he said. "I am paying you a quarter of the recovery. That is standard in any business operation." She looked at him steadily. "That was part of my job." "It was not part of the terms I offered you," he said simply, and went back to his study. She sat with the $2 for a long moment, and her jaw worked slightly, and she put them in her apron pocket and did not say anything further. But the next morning there was a pie cooling on the kitchen windowsill when he came down before 5, and nobody mentioned it. He ate 3 pieces of that pie over the course of 2 days and thought about Cora Graves rather more than he intended to. This was inconvenient, because Lionel Lockhart was a man who had organized his life with considerable care and a certain amount of deliberate self-denial, and he was aware that he was in a position of responsibility in relation to her. She was his employee. She was recently widowed, and she was quite obviously a woman who would need a year of solid ground beneath her before she was ready to think about anything beyond survival. He knew this not because he had been told it or reasoned it abstractly, but because he understood it from the inside, having spent 2 years after his father's death running a ranch in debt, and finding that the business of grief had a practical component that had to be attended to before the emotional one could be acknowledged. So he was careful. He was careful in the way that a person is careful with something they have recognized as valuable and fragile, and not yet theirs to handle. He was also unavoidably in her company for several hours of every day, in a house that, while not small, was not large enough to avoid a person who made excellent pie and organized his supply pantry with a logic that he found genuinely impressive. The rhythm of the ranch in summer was relentless, and Cora found that relentlessness to be a mercy. In Pico's Valley, there had been long evenings after Thomas died when the work was done, and the silence of the empty house sat on her like something physical, and she had had to actively occupy herself to avoid the kind of thinking that led nowhere good. Here, the days ran long and full. The ranch hands needed feeding at consistent hours. The horses needed attention. The summer heat required early starts and midday shelter and late evening work after the temperature dropped. There was always something. She also found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she genuinely liked the land. The country north of Dusty Creek had a severity to it that was different from the Pecos Valley drier, more dramatic, the ridge turning different colors in different light, the arroyos that slashed across the grassland carrying water in sudden, brief violence during the summer rains, and then going dry and dusty within hours. She had grown up in Missouri, green and humid and forested, and she had spent 4 years in the comparative flatness of the Pecos Valley, and this high, harsh, red country spoke to something in her that she had not known was there. She began riding out in the early mornings when she could, borrowing the steady bay gelding that Lionel had quietly assigned to her use without announcing the assignment, simply leaving word with the head stableman that Cora was to have full access to Biscuit whenever she wanted him. She discovered this quietly, on a morning when she went to the barn and the stable hand, a young man named Pedro, told her that the bay had been put aside for her. She stood in the barn doorway with the early light orange behind her and felt something catch in her throat that she could not entirely account for. She rode out on Biscuit that morning before sunrise and came back an hour later with dust on her skirts and her hair coming loose from its braid and a color in her face that was not entirely from the wind. Lionel was at the corral when she came back. He was assessing a young horse that Abe had brought in from the south pasture, and he turned at the sound of the hooves and watched her ride in. She was sitting Biscuit well, easy in the saddle with the loose-hipped confidence of someone who had been riding since childhood, and she had her face turned slightly into the morning breeze, and in the early light with her dark hair coming loose, she looked like someone who belonged to this particular landscape in a way that he had not seen in a long time, and his chest did something he recognized as trouble. He turned back to the young horse and kept his expression entirely neutral. "Good morning," she said, swinging down. "How was the north pasture?" She looked at him. "I did not say I went to the north pasture. The clay on Biscuits near Fetlock is from the north draw," he said. "Only place around here it turns that particular shade of orange." She looked at the horse's leg and then back at him, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Observant," she said. "Occupational necessity," he said. She led Biscuit into the barn, and Lionel went back to the young horse, and Abe Purvis, who had been watching from the fence rail with the passive attention of a man who had seen a great deal in his life, said nothing whatsoever, which was characteristic. The 4th of July brought 3 days of festivities to Dusty Creek, and the ranch gave the hands time off in rotating shifts to go into town and partake. Lionel went in on the 3rd day to oversee a supply delivery and invited Cora, framing it as a practical matter. There were domestic supplies she should choose herself. And she went, wearing her better dress and her good hat, and carrying herself through the crowded main street of Dusty Creek with the calm self-possession of a woman who had been through worse than a frontier holiday. The town was loud and bright and slightly chaotic in the way of small western towns celebrating national holidays. There was music from the saloon, and a band of sorts set up in the square, children everywhere, the smell of food and gunpowder from the firecrackers that various young men were setting off at intervals. A group of men were engaged in a roping competition in the open lot beside the livery, and a crowd had gathered to watch. Cora stopped to watch the roping competition. Lionel stopped beside her and she said without looking at him, "That man on the gray is going to miss. His loop is too wide." The man on the gray released his loop. It fell wide. There was a groan from the crowd and some good-natured jeering. "You know roping," Lionel said. "Thomas was one of the best I ever saw," she said. "He taught me the theory of it, if not the practice." She paused. "I never had his arm for it." "What does his technique look like, theoretically?" She turned to look at him, and there was something cautiously alive in her face. "Are you asking me to explain roping theory to you? You grew up on a cattle ranch." I grew up on a cattle ranch with a father who roped by feel and never explained his method, he said. There is a difference, she told him. She explained the loop size and the release point and the weight distribution of the throw, and as she talked her hands moved slightly at her sides, unconsciously demonstrating, and he watched her face, which was engaged and specific and entirely lacking in the careful opacity that she wore as a default, and he thought that she was, in this unguarded moment, quite enormously appealing. They ate at the food stalls. He bought them both plates of roasted corn and beans and flatbread without making a ceremony of it, simply handing her a plate as one might hand a colleague a tool, and watched the rest of the competition, and walked back to where the wagon was tied in the afternoon heat. She fell asleep on the wagon seat on the way back to the ranch, her shoulder eventually coming to rest against his, and he drove the 4 miles home with his shoulder pressed against hers and his jaw very tight and his eyes on the road. She woke up as they turned onto the ranch road and straightened immediately, pressing herself back to her side of the seat. I apologize, she said. Nothing to apologize for, he said, in a voice that he worked to keep even. She did not say anything else, and neither did he, but the warmth of her shoulder against his lingered for the rest of the evening like an ember under ash. In August, 3 things happened that changed the shape of what was between them. The first was the storm. It came up fast on a Tuesday, the way storms did in that country, an hour of ordinary afternoon heat, and then a darkness building in the northwest that moved with a speed that the sky out there sometimes had, like something alive and angry. By the time it reached the ranch, it was a full-throated summer storm with lightning cracking over the ridge and rain coming in sheets and wind that rattled the window glass. Lionel and Abe and 4 of the hands were out in the east pasture when it hit, trying to bring in the horses that had been turned out that morning. Cora saw the storm coming from the kitchen window and went to the barn without waiting to be asked, because the roof of the hay storage lean-to on the northwest side had a weak spot that she had noticed 3 weeks ago and had mentioned to Abe, who had agreed it needed attention and had put it on the list that had not yet reached the top. She got to the barn with the rain starting and climbed into the hay storage and was bracing the weak rafter with a length of timber she found in the equipment corner when the full force of the storm hit. The rafter held, the lean-to stayed up. She came back through the barn with wet hair and sodden skirts and one arm scraped from elbow to wrist where she had caught it on a nail, and Lionel was standing in the barn doorway with his hat running water, breathing hard from the run in from the pasture, and he looked at her arm and his expression changed. "What happened?" he said. "The lean-to rafter," she said. "I braced it, it held." He looked at her arm again. "That needs to be cleaned." "I know," she said. "I will see to it." "Come inside," he said. There was something different in his voice. Not commanding, he was not a commanding man by nature, but more direct than usual, with a quality that was almost concerned, and she followed him into the kitchen because the storm was still raging, and she was cold and wet and her arms stung, and she was too practical to refuse help on principle. He had her sit at the kitchen table, and he got the medicine box from the shelf where she had reorganized it 2 months ago, and he cleaned her arm with a gentleness that she had not expected from hands the size of his, deliberate and careful, not flinching when she flinched. "You should have waited for someone else to do that," he said, meaning the rafter. "There was not time," she said. "I know," he said. He tied the bandage and sat back and looked at her. "I know you know that too." The storm was very loud outside, rain hammering the roof and lightning stuttering white through the windows, and they were very close together at the kitchen table with the lamplight between them and his hand still near her arm, and she became suddenly and precisely aware of the distance between his face and hers, which was not very much. She stood up and thanked him and went to change out of her wet clothes, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while after she was gone and looked at the medicine box and the folded bandage cloth and did not move. The second thing that happened in August was the arrival of a man named Sutherland. Wade Sutherland was a land agent from Las Cruces, with a wide smile and expensive boots, who came riding onto the Lockhart ranch on a Thursday morning under the pretense of general neighborly business, and within an hour had made 3 separate comments about the widow Graves that Cora, who was in the next room, could hear clearly through the wall. The comments were not vicious. They were the kind of comments that a certain kind of man makes about a certain kind of woman, carrying the implication that a young widow working alone on a ranch was either available or unfortunate or probably both, and they were said with the comfortable assumption that the other man in the room would join in the general assessment. Lionel Lockhart's voice, when he responded, was not raised. It never was. But there was a quality to it that she had not heard before, a flat, clipped precision that cut the legs out of Sutherland's easy manner like a knife through rope. Mrs. Graves is a skilled professional who manages this operation with a competence I have not found in many workers, male or female, Lionel said. She is here because she is excellent at her work and she has my complete respect. I do not know what else might need to be said on the subject. She heard a pause. Of course, Sutherland said, in a somewhat different tone. She stood in the next room with a stack of folded linen and her eyes on the middle distance, and felt something move through her chest that was warm and complicated, and not at all simple. The third thing that happened in August was a conversation. It happened on a Sunday evening, the one time in the week when the work genuinely slowed and the ranch settled into a different quiet. She was on the porch with her coffee and her book, and Lionel came out and leaned on the porch rail and looked out toward the ridge, which was going orange and purple in the late light, and after a while he said, "My mother left when I was 12. She looked up from her book. She did not go far, he said. She went to Santa Fe, married a merchant. She was not a bad woman, she just was not built for this kind of life and stayed in it too long trying to be. When she left, I think she was mostly a relief to herself." He paused. "My father worked himself to death in the 11 years after, not from grief, I do not think, or not only from grief, more because the working was the only language he had for everything." She closed her book. "How old were you when he died?" 23. He turned to look at her. "I am sorry, I do not know why I said that." "Do not be sorry," she said. "I appreciate the company." He looked at her for a moment with those careful dark eyes. "Do you want to talk about Thomas?" The directness of the question surprised her enough that she answered honestly rather than deflecting. "Not yet," she said, "but I think I will, sometime." He nodded. "I will be here," he said simply, and went back inside, and she sat on the porch until the ridge went dark and the stars came out, enormous and close the way they only were in that particular high country, and thought about the word yet and what it meant that she had used it. September moved differently than August had. The quality of the air changed. The light changed sharper and cleaner. The mornings cold enough now to need a coat. The evenings coming earlier and carrying a wood smoke smell from neighboring ranches. The rhythm of the work changed too. It slowed slightly in some ways and intensified in others. The fall cattle work beginning, sorting and branding the late calves, preparing the herd for the market drive that would happen in October. Cora went out with the men for the fall branding, because Abe asked her to come and she was willing, and she worked fence and helped with the calves and came back at the end of those days with a sense of competence and physical tiredness that she had always liked better than the alternative. Lionel was out there too, and she watched him work the cattle. He was genuinely skilled, easy in the saddle in the way that some men were who had grown up on horseback, and he worked alongside his men without the affectation of a man performing authority. She mentioned this to him one evening in the kitchen, with the usual casualness of two people who had become accustomed to talking. "You work like one of the hands," she said. "I grew up as one of the hands," he said. "My father did not believe in the idea of the owner's son having different work than anyone else." "Mine either," she said. "He was a Missouri farmer. I was the oldest child and the work did not know what I was." "How many siblings?" 3 brothers, 2 sisters. The brothers all went west eventually. The sisters stayed and married farmers." She paused. "My mother thought I would do the same." "What happened?" "I met Thomas at a county fair when I was 21. He was heading to New Mexico territory and he asked me to come along and I said yes. She said this with a matter-of-factness that was not forced. He was a good man, Lionel. He was not dramatic about things and he was not given to speeches, but he worked hard and he was honest and he made me laugh on most days. Not everyone gets that. It was the most she had said about Thomas to him at one time, and she was aware of it, and she sat with her coffee and watched him to see what he would do with it. He did not respond with the kind of rushing, well-meant sympathy that she had been bracing against. He said, "He sounds like someone worth missing." She felt her throat tighten in a way that was not unpleasant. "Yes," she said, "he was." They sat with that for a moment, and then he said, "My father was the same kind of man. No speeches. But when the work needed doing, he did it, and when the word needed saying, he said it plainly." "Good men tend to be similar in the important ways," she said. "They do," he agreed. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge with the first real bite of autumn in it, and inside the kitchen was warm and lit and smelled of the coffee she had made. And Cora Graves looked at Lionel Lockhart across the kitchen table and felt the very clear and somewhat terrifying understanding that she was not, in fact, merely becoming accustomed to his company. She was becoming fond of it. She was becoming fond of him, of his economy of words and his careful attention, of the way he worked, and the way he was honest, and the way he had never once looked at her with that particular combination of pity and condescension that she had been dreading since the day Thomas died. She put this recognition somewhere she intended to leave it alone and went to bed. She did not entirely leave it alone. October came, and with it the cattle drive, which took Lionel and Abe and half the hands away for 10 days to drive the herd to the railhead at Socorro. He left her with the ranch to manage along with 3 of the remaining hands, and he gave her the authority clearly and without ceremony, told the men she was in charge of the domestic operation, and that any household decisions went through her, and she managed it without incident, which was satisfying. What was less satisfying was that the ranch felt different with him gone, and she recognized the difference too precisely for it to be anything other than what it was. He came back on a Thursday evening, arriving after dark, and she heard the horses come into the yard, and the voices of the men, and she stood in the kitchen and told herself she was not waiting. She was making coffee, which was a completely separate activity that had nothing to do with listening for hoofbeats. He came into the kitchen with trail dust on everything and his hat in his hand, and he looked tired in the good way of a man who has completed a piece of work he set out to do, and he said, "Good evening," and she said, "There is coffee," and she poured him a cup and set it on the table, and he sat down and drank half of it before he said anything else. Then he said, "Everything all right here?" "Yes," she said. "No incidents. The east fence needs a section replaced, I marked it, and the supply wagon needs a new wheel before winter. Both items are in the log." He nodded. "Good. Good drive. Good prices. Abe drove a harder bargain at Socorro than I would have. He has a talent for it." She sat down across from him with her own cup. "You should sleep." "In a minute," he said, and turned his cup in his hands and looked at her with the careful directness that she had come to recognize as his specific variety of honesty. "I missed this kitchen," he said. It was said plainly, the way he said things, but with a quality beneath it that she heard very clearly. She held his gaze for a moment. "It did not miss you back," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that it functioned just as well without you," she said, in a voice that was entirely steady and gave nothing away. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same plain quality, "I did not mean the kitchen." The room was very quiet. The lamp flame moved slightly. She became aware of her own heartbeat with an unusual precision. She stood up and collected the cups. "You should sleep," she said again. "There is a lot of work in the morning." "Cora," she stopped. She did not turn around. "I know the timing is not," he started and then stopped, and she could hear him choosing words with the deliberate care he brought to things that mattered. "I know this is not the right conversation to be having. Not yet. I just wanted you to know that my interest in you is not something I intend to act on in a way that makes your situation here uncomfortable. You work here, and you have the right to do that without anything complicated from me. That will not change regardless of anything." She stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned around, and she looked at him sitting at her kitchen table with the lamplight on his tired face, and she thought about every careful, considered thing he had done since the day she walked into his supply post with nothing but a carpet bag and a jawline like a dare. She thought about the sign in the window and the fair wages and the horse assigned to her use and the $2 for the accounting error and the way he had spoken to Sutherland and the way he had cleaned her arm and the way he had said Thomas sounds like someone worth missing without flinching or overreaching. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "I know," she said again, more quietly. "And I am not uncomfortable. I want to be clear about that." They looked at each other across the kitchen, and there was something between them that was new and real and still a little frightening. And then she said good night and went to her room, and Lionel Lockhart sat at the kitchen table for a good long while after she was gone, finishing his coffee, and the expression on his face was one that a person watching might have recognized as a man trying very carefully not to hope too hard. November arrived with a cold snap that brought the first frost and turned the grass on the ridge to silver in the early mornings. The work shifted again, the pace of winter preparation, laying in supplies, winterizing the outbuildings, bringing the vulnerable cattle into the home pasture. It was busy, practical, constant work, and Cora did her share of it and more, and the days ran along. But something had shifted between her and Lionel in the way that things shift when they have been named, even partially. They were not different in the visible ways. They still worked alongside each other with the same practical ease, still had their kitchen conversations in the evenings, still occupied the same space with the same comfortable efficiency. But there was a new awareness between them that she found she did not want to suppress, and she found herself noticing small things with a new acuity. The way his hands looked when he was writing in his ledger, the way he laughed, which was brief and genuine, and never at someone else's expense, the way he sometimes looked at the ridge in the early morning as though the country were a conversation he was having. On a Sunday in late November, she took Biscuit out in the early morning and rode to the top of the North Ridge for the first time. It was a hard climb, and the air at the top was cold and clear, and the view from the ridge was enormous. The whole of the valley spread out below in the early light, the ranch a cluster of shapes in the tan and rust of the landscape, the town of Dusty Creek a smudge on the horizon 4 miles south. She sat her horse at the top of the ridge and felt the wind and the space and the particular quality of being alone on a high place in good weather. And she thought about Missouri and the Pecos Valley and Thomas and Dusty Creek and Lionel Lockhart. And she thought about what her life was and what it might become, and the thinking did not frighten her the way it had in those terrible silent weeks after Thomas died. When she came back down, Lionel was waiting at the corral fence. He had clearly been there for a few minutes, leaning on the top rail with his coffee. "Top of the North Ridge," he said. "How did you know?" "You were gone an hour and a half and Biscuit's legs are muddy from the north draw and you look like someone who has been standing in a high wind." She dismounted and handed Biscuit to Pedro and came to stand beside him at the fence. "What does someone who has been standing in a high wind look like?" He looked at her with those dark eyes. "Like they have been reminded that they are alive," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said softly, "that is exactly what it is like." He was very close, and she was aware of that with her whole body, and the morning was cold and clear, and the ridge was still purple with shadow behind them. He reached up and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear, the gesture entirely simple and entirely deliberate, and his fingers were warm against her cheek. She caught his hand before he drew it back. She did not pull it down or push it away. She simply held it, her fingers curled around his, for a moment that was its own thing, containing all the months of careful distance and fair wages and unspoken acknowledgement and practical kindness. He turned his hand over under hers and held it back. They stood at the corral fence in the November morning holding hands like two people who had arrived somewhere after a long walk, and neither of them said anything, which was right. December brought the business of Christmas in a frontier town, which was modest by Eastern standards but genuine enough. There was a church service in Dusty Creek that most of the county attended, and a gathering at the ranch for the hands and their families that Cora organized with her characteristic efficiency, and that turned out to be, by everyone's account, considerably more festive than previous years. Owing to the food and the decorations and the particular energy that comes when someone who genuinely enjoys making things good for other people is in charge of an occasion. She made pies. She made several kinds of pie and rolls, and a roasted beef that the hands talked about for weeks after, and she found good quality green pine branches and red berries from the ridge, and made the main house smell like a mountain at Christmas. And on the evening of the gathering she wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had bought with her October wages, and she stood in the kitchen feeling for the first time in a year like a person who was, in fact, going to be all right. Lionel came into the kitchen as she was pouring coffee for the gathering, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said, quietly, "You look like you belong here." She turned with the coffee pot. "I think I might," she said. He had clearly spent some thought on this evening too. He was wearing his good coat and his hair was combed, and he looked, she thought, rather devastating in the way that a tall, lean, dark-eyed man looks when he has made even modest effort at presentation. "May I tell you something?" he said. "You generally tell me things without asking first," she said. "This one is different," he said. She set down the coffee pot and looked at him. "I have admired you since the day you walked into my store," he said. "I have admired the way you work and the way you think and the way you treat people. And in the past months I have come to—" He stopped and took a deliberate breath, which was the only visible sign of effort he gave. "I have come to care for you a great deal, Cora, more than a great deal. I want to say that plainly, and I want to say that there is no obligation attached to it. You have a position here regardless of how you receive this, but I did not want to continue into another year without saying it." The gathering was happening on the other side of the house. She could hear voices and children, and the sound of someone attempting a fiddle. The kitchen was warm and smelled of pine and roasted beef and coffee. She said, "I rode to the top of the ridge in November and thought about what my life was going to be." "I know," he said. "I saw your face when you came back. What did it look like?" "Like a decision." She crossed the kitchen, which was not large, and she stood in front of him and looked up at his face, which she had been studying carefully for months and knew better by now than almost any face she had ever known, and she said, "The decision involved you. I want to be equally plain about that." He put his hand against her jaw, the same way he had at the corral fence, and this time she leaned into it slightly, and he bent down and kissed her, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of two people who have been thinking about a thing for a long time and are finally doing it, careful and certain and warm. And when they separated, she pressed her forehead briefly to his chest, and he rested his chin on her hair, and outside the fiddle scraped into a recognizable tune and someone clapped. And it was a perfect and unlikely and entirely real moment in the kitchen of the Lockhart Ranch in December of 1884. They stayed like that for a little while in the warm and the pine smell, and then she pulled back and picked up the coffee pot and said, "We have guests," and he caught her hand before she could move away and brought it to his lips and kissed her knuckles, which was so uncharacteristic and so earnest and so perfectly him that she felt her whole chest fill with something bright. "Yes," he said, "we do." January was cold and clear and quiet in the way of high desert winters. The ridge dusted with snow, the cattle huddled in the home pasture, the hands doing inside work and mending, and the kind of deep winter maintenance that accumulated over the season. The supply trips to Dusty Creek were occasional and purposeful, and the evenings were long. Cora and Lionel were in no hurry and in every hurry simultaneously, which is the state of two people who are very sure of something, and also aware that the ground it is built on needs time to be solid. They were careful with each other in the particular way of people who have both sustained losses and know what loss weighs. They talked. They talked more in those winter evenings than either of them had ever talked with anyone. About the ranch and the land and their childhoods and their ideas and their losses. About Missouri and the Pecos Valley, and what had built them into the people they were. She told him about Thomas at length one cold January night with both of them at the kitchen table and snow coming down outside, and she cried a little in the telling, and he sat across from her and listened, and did not rush her, and did not offer comfort she had not asked for. And when she was done, she felt lighter in the specific way you feel lighter after you have set something down that you have been carrying alone. He told her about his father and his mother, and the 11 years of debt he had spent rebuilding this ranch. And she listened the way she worked, completely, without interruption, taking in every detail. They were falling in love with the precision and inevitability of two people who had been, in all the important ways, made for each other and were simply arriving at the recognition. In February, in the particular sweetness of a cold night with the wood stove going well and the kitchen warm, he asked her if she would be willing to have a different kind of conversation. She said, "What kind?" he said. "The kind about what comes next." She looked at him across the table. "I am listening," she said. He was not a man who made speeches, and she was not a woman who required them. He said simply that he had thought about it with care and that his feelings were not going to change and that he believed hers were equally settled, and that what he was asking was whether she would be willing to consider marrying him when she was ready, on whatever schedule was right for her without any pressure from him. She said, "You are asking me in the kitchen on a Tuesday." "I had thought about a more elaborate approach," he said, "and then I thought that you would probably find it excessive." She laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind she had not heard from herself in a long time, and the sound of it in the warm kitchen was the best thing he had heard in years. "You know me well," she said. "I am trying to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who would have understood this, who had been a good man and who would have wanted her to find another good man, and who she would carry with her gently for the rest of her life, not as a wound but as a foundation. She thought about the ridge and the morning wind and the sign in the supply post window and the $12 a month and the $2 on the table and the bay horse in the barn and every small, careful, dignified kindness that had been extended to her in the disguise of professional respect. "Yes," she said. "Not for a while yet, but yes." He nodded once, and the steadiness in his face went warm around the edges in a way she recognized as him being moved but not making a production of it, which she loved. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They married in April of 1885 on a bright cold morning with the ridge still carrying snow at the top, in the Dusty Creek church with the hands and half the county in attendance. Cora wore a dress she had made herself from pale gray wool with white trim, and her hair was up and she looked, in the opinion of every person in that church, like a woman who had found what she had come looking for. Lionel stood at the front of the church in his good coat with his hands at his sides, and his face calm with the specific calm of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and is not afraid of it. Abe Purvis stood witness on Lionel's side, stoic as geography. A woman named Clara Hennessy, who ran the millinery in Dusty Creek and had been Cora's first friend in town, stood with her on the other side and dabbed her eyes at the ceremony, which Cora found both touching and unnecessary, and she loved Clara for it. When the minister asked for the vows, Cora looked at Lionel Lockhart and said them clearly and without wavering, and he looked back at her with those careful, seeing eyes and said them back with a simplicity and directness that was entirely characteristic of him, and she felt the words land somewhere real and permanent. The celebration after was at the ranch, of course. Cora had organized it herself, because she was not about to let someone else run a gathering in her kitchen, and it was cheerful and well-fed and ran until the sun went behind the ridge, and then the hands took themselves to the bunkhouse with considerable goodwill, and the house was theirs. They stood on the porch in the cooling evening with glasses of the decent whiskey that one of the hands had contributed from a private supply, and the ridge was going purple in the last of the light, and Lionel said, "Hello, Mrs. Lockhart." She turned and looked at him. She had known since October that she was going to keep the name Graves as well. Thomas had given it to her, and she had earned it in those 4 Pecos Valley years, and she intended to carry both names forward as a woman carries both the places she has been. But in this moment, she let the new name sit in the air between them and felt that it was good. "Hello," she said. Summer of 1885 was the best summer she had spent since Missouri, and that was a thing she recognized clearly enough to be grateful for. The ranch ran well and smoothly, and Cora's role in it shifted and expanded. She was no longer only the housekeeper. She was the co-owner's wife and a full partner in the daily decisions of the operation, and she brought to it the same quality of attention and competence that had always been hers, only now with the authority that matched it. She rode out regularly and knew the land as well as any of the hands. She kept the books for both the household and the supply post, because she had suggested it and Lionel had agreed without the slightest hesitation, and she found 3 more accounting errors in the first month that saved the ranch a combined $11, which she found deeply satisfying. She did not stop cooking or managing the house, because she was genuinely good at those things and they needed to be done, but she stopped doing them as an employee and started doing them as someone who owned the result, which was a difference that she felt in the way she moved through the rooms. In August, she told Lionel she was expecting. They were at the kitchen table, which had become the location of all important conversations between them, and she told him plainly and without ceremony, and he looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, something that stripped away all the careful control and left something nakedly joyful in its place. And he crossed to her and put his arms around her and held her with a fierceness that was entirely unlike his usual careful precision. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed. Their son was born in April of 1886, which pleased her. She had hoped for a boy first, because boys in this country were slightly easier to launch into the world, and she was practical about such things. They named him Daniel Thomas Lockhart, the Thomas for Thomas Graves, which was her idea and which Lionel agreed to without a moment's hesitation. Daniel Thomas Lockhart came into the world loud and healthy, and with a head of dark hair that clearly had opinions about its own direction, and the whole ranch celebrated. And Abe Purvis came to the house on the day of the birth and stood in the kitchen looking at the baby with an expression of deep and dignified pleasure and said, "Good," which was high praise from Abe. The territory changed in those years, the way it always had. The railroad pushed further, more settlers came, the old open range was slowly being fenced and divided, and the nature of the cattle business changed with it. Lionel navigated those changes with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and Cora was beside him in the navigation, her head for figures and organization, providing the kind of practical ballast that the operation needed. They had their arguments, because they were both strong-willed people with clear opinions, and their arguments had the quality of genuine engagement, nobody performing, nobody winning, both people eventually arriving at something better than either had started with. She won the argument about the supply post expansion that he had been too conservative to commit to, and the expansion paid for itself in 8 months. He won the argument about which bull to bring in for the spring breeding program, and she acknowledged it when the calves came in heavy and strong. There was a matter in the winter of 1887, when a man named Calhoun came through the territory buying up small claims and homesteads with offers that sounded reasonable and contained language that was not, and several of the neighboring families found themselves in bad positions. Cora, who read contracts with the same thoroughness she brought to ledger books, reviewed 2 of those contracts at the request of a neighbor woman named Mrs. Rays, and identified clauses that effectively gave Calhoun mineral rights under the surface of properties for which he was only paying surface value prices. She wrote up a clear and specific accounting of what she had found and brought it to the Dusty Creek sheriff, who was a reasonable man named Alderson, and also to the Territorial Land Office, and Calhoun moved on to easier territory within a month. Mrs. Rays brought her a woven blanket as a gift, which she hung in the kitchen, and the two women remained close friends for many years afterward. Cora was conscious of the ways the territory was changing, of the pressures on small landowners, on Hispanic families who had held land for generations, but whose claims were vulnerable in ways that the newer Anglo arrivals were not, on the Apache communities who had been pushed steadily north and confined to increasingly limited land. These were not comfortable truths, and she did not pretend they were, and she gave what help she could in practical ways when the opportunities arose, and she taught her children, when they came, to understand that the land they stood on had a history longer and more complicated than their family's name on a deed. Their second child was a daughter, born in June of 1888, and they named her Alina Rose, and she came into the world with a calm disposition and her father's watchful eyes. And Daniel, who was 2, regarded her with the wary assessment of a child who had heard a great deal of enthusiasm about this new development and was reserving judgment. The ranch grew in those years, not recklessly but steadily, in the way that things grow when they are well tended. Lionel bought 2 adjacent parcels that became available through natural attrition and expanded the cattle operation accordingly. Cora opened a second supply post in a growing settlement 15 miles east, managed by a capable young woman from Albuquerque named Iris, who Cora had hired and trained with the same practical directness with which Lionel had once hired her. She thought about that sometimes, the circularity of it, the way that one careful, dignified act of practical help could ripple outward. And it did not make her sentimental exactly, but it made her grateful in a precise and specific way. In 1890, the territory of New Mexico was still pushing toward statehood, which would not come for another 22 years, and the land was still wild in many of the ways that mattered, vast and indifferent and beautiful and difficult. And Cora Graves Lockhart was the kind of woman who had been made for it. She was 32 that year, and she looked like she had grown into herself in the way that the country around her had settled and specific and containing a great deal of depth below the surface. Lionel was 36 and had acquired a few more lines around his eyes and had not lost a bit of the careful attention that had drawn her to him from the beginning. They had been married 5 years, and the familiarity between them was the good kind, layered and particular, built from thousands of days of genuine proximity, containing both comfort and discovery, the way the best things between two people do. Daniel was 4 that summer and had developed strong opinions about horses, which he expressed loudly and often. Alina was 2 and had begun walking with a purposeful confidence that made her mother laugh every time. The kitchen in the Lockhart Ranch house still had the woven blanket from Mrs. Rays on the wall, and Thomas Graves's photograph was on the small shelf in the sitting room beside the window, where it caught the morning light, and Cora had placed it there deliberately, because he had been good and real and part of her story, and the story did not require his absence to be a good one. On a September evening, with the ridge going golden in the last light and the air carrying the first coolness of the turning season, Cora stood on the porch with her hands around a coffee cup, and Lionel came up behind her and put his arms around her, and they watched the ridge together. She leaned back against him. He was warm and solid and smelled of leather and the outdoors and himself, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the sign in the window had been the beginning of everything. Help wanted, strong back, no complaints. She had brought a strong back. He had given her the work she asked for and wrapped something else inside it so carefully, and with such deliberate dignity that she had not felt its shape until she was already standing inside it. And by then the something else had become indistinguishable from the work itself, which was how it had always been with the best things he did, quiet and practical and entirely, irreversibly, real. "What are you thinking about?" he said against her hair. "The sign in the window," she said, "when I first came." "What about it?" She turned in his arms so she was facing him, which she could do now with the ease of two people who had been close for long enough that proximity was simply home, and she looked at his face, the white scar along the jaw, the deep-set careful eyes that had softened when they looked at her from the very first day and had never stopped, and she said, "You knew who I was when I came in." He held her gaze. "You put that sign up for me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The position was real," he said. "The wages were fair and the work was genuine and you were exactly as qualified as I needed. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "That is the part I am telling you was the right thing. You made it real. You made it something I could keep my dignity with." She paused. "And then you gave me everything else." He put his hand against her face, the way he always had, and his thumb traced her cheekbone with the particular gentleness of a man who is aware of how much something matters. "You earned everything here," he said. "I know," she said again, and she did know it, and the knowing was not diminished by also knowing that the opportunity had been shaped for her by someone who had cared about her before she had even given him the chance to. Both things were true simultaneously, and she had come to understand that this was the shape of the best kind of love, not rescue, not charity, but the careful construction of a space where a capable person could be exactly who they were, and the dignity of that was the gift. She kissed him, right there on the porch in the September evening with the ridge going dark behind them, and the sound of Daniel's voice carrying from somewhere inside the house, and Alina laughing at something that was only funny to a 2-year-old. He kissed her back with everything he had, the way he always had since that first December night in the kitchen, without reservation or performance, and she felt the years between them and the years ahead of them as something continuous and true. When they separated, she pressed her forehead to his the way she sometimes did, which was the closest thing to a private language between them, and he held her with his arms around her waist and his chin resting on top of her head, and outside the dark came down over the ridge and the first stars appeared, enormous and close in the high New Mexico sky. "Strong back and no complaints," she said quietly. "That was always the least of what you brought," he said. Inside the house, Daniel had found his father's old hat and was wearing it over his eyes and informing Alina at considerable volume about the correct way to rope a calf, which he had observed but not yet executed, and Alina was either listening with great interest or had simply found a draft of air near the baseboard that required investigation. It was, at 2 years old, genuinely difficult to tell. The ranch hands in the bunkhouse were settling into the evening with cards and conversation. Iris at the East Supply Post had sent a letter that week reporting that the October inventory was ahead of last year's. Abe Purvis had mentioned that morning that the winter pasture grass was coming in better than it had in 3 years. The accounts were balanced to the penny, and the new calf barn was completed, and the well on the north property had been reinforced before the cold weather came. Everything was attended to. Everything was in its right order. And the two people on the porch stayed where they were a little longer, because the evening was good and the ridge was beautiful and they were in no hurry, which was the luxury of people who had arrived somewhere and knew it, and intended to stay. They had 3 years ahead of them before Cora would run for and win a seat on the Dusty Creek Town Council, the first woman to do so in that county. She did it practically and without much announcement, because there were 3 specific matters that needed addressing and she had the skills to address them, and the town agreed after the fact that she had been correct. They had 20 more years in that house before Daniel, who did turn out to be extraordinary with a rope and even better with figures, took over the primary operation of the ranch and gave them a little more time for the evenings they had always been good at. Alina grew up to be a doctor, which surprised nobody who had seen the calm and intelligent way she had regarded the world since the age of 2, and she set up practice in Santa Fe, and her parents visited every spring and every fall. There was a third child, eventually another son, born in 1892, whom they named James after Lionel's father, and who had his mother's coal dark hair and his father's careful eyes, and grew up to be the kind of boy who kept the books and fixed the machinery, and held the operation together in the quiet and essential way of people who do not need to be seen to do the work. All of it, the ranch and the children and the years and the evening light on the ridge, grew from the sign in the window, and the pride of a woman who asked for work, and not sympathy, and the understanding of a man who knew that the most generous thing he could do was give her exactly what she asked for, and build everything else inside it where she could find it when she was ready. They lived in that house for the rest of their long lives, and they were in love with each other at the end with the same specificity and the same depth as they had been at the beginning, only more so, the way love is when it has been tested by real things and has held. And on evenings when the ridge went gold and the sky went wide and the air came down cold and clean from the high country, they stood on the porch together with their coffee cups and their long years between them, and the land stretched out in every direction as far as either of them could see, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was entirely and irreversibly theirs.